In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the engine oil pan on this Ford F-250 with the 5.4 liter V8 engine. Let's get started. From underneath the truck, you'll see that towards the center here, you have your engine oil pan with a 16mm drain plug. Put a socket or a wrench on that and break it free. I have a drain pan waiting to collect the oil. It's already starting to drip. And unfortunately, this one's a little bit stuck, so sometimes you have to just unthread it all the way. There we go. Remove the drain plug. It's down to a drip, so I'm going to cap this off. That way we can continue with our job without it dripping on us. Just going to snug it up by hand. There we go. Now let's remove the driver's side engine mount bolts or mounting nuts. They're 24mm in size. There's 3 of them. Just break them free. They shouldn't be extremely tight. On the passenger side, you'll have 4 21mm mounting nuts to be removed so the engine mount can be loosened up. And 2 on the top that you'll have to get by hand. Now with a 21mm socket, let's remove the 2 mounting nuts holding the transmission mount onto this cross member. Now we're up here so we can remove a couple things to make clearance to lift up the engine with an engine support so that we can get the oil pan off from the bottom and clear that cross member. I'm going to remove the intake piece here as well as the adapter that goes on the throttle body. Otherwise, you'll hit the top of the firewall pretty quickly. If you have this hose that goes over, remove it, and you don't have to disconnect it on either end, you just have to push it aside. There's going to be an 8mm clamp here that you have to loosen up in order to remove the intake off of the air box. Just loosen it up a few turns. You should be able to pull this off. There we go. Get this hose out of the way. And then on the other end of this, you'll see another clamp. Mine's a little bit hidden down there, but 8mm also. Loosen that up. With both of these loosened up, you'll be able to remove this piece and set it aside. Now over here, you'll see this line that connects onto the intake or this adapter with this green tab. If you push it out of the way, you'll be able to pop the line off and just set it aside. This piece is held on with 4 bolts. 2 8mm on the front and 2 10mm on the back. You may not have the same size bolts. Looks like someone's already been in here before, so that's what I'm going to use to take this off. With all this hardware removed, you should be able to pull this right up and out, and that gives us a lot more clearance over here. I recommend covering the throttle body with a paper towel, a rag, or something. That way any debris that might fall in here while we work doesn't actually go in the throttle body. We'll have to remove the fan shroud off of the radiator. You don't have to pull it out of the truck, but just loosen it so when the fan comes up, it can push the fan shroud up with it. Otherwise, you'll have some clearance issues there. There should be two 10mm headed bolts, one on each side. Remove them both. Do the same to the other side. With both out, you should be able to pull this up. Like I said, no need to remove it. It just needs to be able to do this so the fan shroud, or the fan, can push the shroud up with it. Now I'm going to raise and support the engine and transmission by this pole jack. If you're on the ground and you're not on a lift, you can actually just use an engine hoist if you have that available and lift up the engine through the engine compartment. If you jack up from underneath, make sure it's on the corner of the oil pan, the transmission pan that is, not in the middle, and just raise it up a couple inches. Now use a 13mm socket, go around the entire oil pan and just remove all the bolts. You'll definitely need a swivel for a few of these. Remove this 10mm bolt that holds this bracket onto the transmission cooler assembly. There we go. We're going to have to remove the inspection plate bolts at this point, which are two 13mm bolts accessed from the back side of this bell housing. I need to disconnect the transmission cooler assembly here. This is basically this is what directs the fluid from the transmission lines to the actual cooler. And it's not going to be on every truck. This is going to be on the early models. If you don't have this, well, you're going to have to just skip this step because your oil pan should be ready to come out at this point. However, if you have it, use a 22mm wrench to hold the cooler, and then either a 3/4 or a 19mm to break these fittings free. And hopefully yours actually break free. A lot of times what happens is the fitting gets stuck on the line and it'll try to spin the line with it. Now on the other side, it does have a quick disconnect, but the reason I'm not disconnecting that side is because I need to free it up from these lines. I do have enough flex in the other side to not have to mess with it. And I would rather disconnect less fittings and create less potential leaks in the future. All of these have O-rings on them, and the O-rings don't always seal up perfectly once they've been disconnected. Have a drain pan ready to collect all the fluid. Okay, there's one. Do the same to the top one. All right, that's out. We can pull this away. Just like I said, I have plenty of space here to move this assembly. The lines are no big deal. They can stay here. It was this clearance that we needed, really. From the front of the engine, with the oil pan down, you should have enough clearance to unbolt the two 8mm bolts that hold the pickup tube onto the oil pump. There's one here that you can easily see. The other one is at the top. There's one. the other. At this point, pickup tube should be able to come down off the oil pump. On the back of the oil pan, or on the engine block I should say, because it's right up there, there's a 10mm bolt holding on the other side of the pickup tube. Unbolt that as well. There we go. Pickup tube falls down in the oil pan, we'll leave it there. Now there should be enough space here to pull the oil pan down and out. It'll need quite a bit of maneuvering, so just find the right angle and slide it straight out. There it is. Make sure that you don't tip it yet because there's still oil in it. Take the pickup tube. We'll obviously have to reuse that. There's the old gasket. Make sure it didn't get stuck on the engine. There's the oil pan. There is an oil level sensor on the side of the oil pan. Ours has the sensor, however, someone's already been in there and there was no harness for it. So there was nothing for me to unplug. If yours has it, and obviously it's plugged in, you will have to unplug it, but not all trucks have it. So if yours doesn't have it, there's nothing to worry about. Now I'm going to use a scraper. If you don't have a gasket scraper, use a razor blade and clean up the entire surface around the engine so that the new gasket can seal up properly. You have RTV at the back. There's a cover all the way here. 2 spots with RTV, and then the whole front timing cover where it connects to the engine block should also have RTV. You want to make sure you get all that off, as well as all of the other debris and corrosion and leftover gasket that is everywhere else. Here's the front of the engine where the front timing cover is. This is what I was talking about. You need to scrape off all of the old gasket. This is RTV as well. You got to get it nice and clean. It doesn't have to be shiny like a mirror, but it does have to be clean and ready to accept some new RTV. This crack right here where the timing cover meets the engine block, if that doesn't get sealed up, it will leak. And you don't want to leave any strings of old RTV like this because they can get easily sucked up into the pickup tube, and that would cause some issues. Now we have to degrease the whole surface that we cleaned, so everywhere where the oil pan will sit, especially at the front where the timing cover meets the engine block. There's a seam here on the other side, and then there's another cover in the back for the rear main seal that has to be cleaned up very well as well, because we had to add a little bit of RTV here so that the oil pan can seal up. Take some brake parts cleaner on a clean rag and wipe it off. Make sure there is no oil and no debris left after wiping. I'm going to add some RTV to the seam here, just a little bit. You don't need a whole lot. If you put too much, it'll actually squeeze out and into the engine. That's not a good thing. The oil pickup tube will get clogged up with it. Do the same on the other side of the front timing cover, and then we'll do the same on the rear. This is the cover on the rear of the engine. Same deal over here. A little bit of RTV right on that seam. There we go. We need to swap the O-ring on the oil pickup tube. The new gasket should come with a new O-ring. Remove the old one, discard it, put on the new one. Now let's bring up the new oil pan with a new gasket and the pickup tube. Don't forget that. Slide it into position. Make sure you don't pinch wires or anything. There we go. Now we have to let the oil pan sit here so we can bolt up the pickup tube. Bring up the pickup tube. Make sure that O-ring gets seated into position. And let's put in the bolts. There's 2 little 8mm headed bolts that hold this on the oil pump side. All right, so they're both started. I'm gonna go as far as I can with them. Then we'll have to put on the other bolt on that bracket further down. That way I know everything is seated. Then I will come back and tighten these. Now further back on the bracket side, try to line it up. That's gonna be pretty tricky on here because, well, you can't see much. Just gonna go ahead and tighten this up all the way. All right. The torque for this bolt is 18 foot-pounds. I unfortunately don't have a torque wrench that'll fit up here. I do, however, have a long ratchet, so that's what I'm gonna use. Just snug it up nice and tight. All right, perfect, that's tight. Let's move to the front. 89 inch-pounds is the torque for these two little 8mm headed bolts, so a lot less. Let's just snug them up. Okay, that's one. And two, we'll double check them. I can't get a torque wrench in here either. There we go, so 89 inch-pounds. Now let's get the oil pan and gasket up into position. Make sure everything's lined up. And you wanna try to move it around. You wanna move it around as little as possible so you don't smear the RTV. Have a bolt ready to start in. Doesn't matter which one it is. As soon as you start that one in, go for a second one. That should line things up a lot better. I also cleaned up my bolts. There's no oil on them. Threads are clean. The holes are blown out with compressed air. I recommend you do the same if you have access to compressed air. And once you start these in, they should thread on all the way smoothly by hand. At that point, you'll be able to let go of the oil pan to start in all the other ones. There we go. Now we have to snug up the bolts. The torque for these is in a 3-step sequence. First step is gonna be 18 inch-pounds. That's nothing, that's really just bottomed out by hand. So tightening these up with a socket will take care of that. And then 15 foot-pounds is the next step. At that point, you're gonna wanna go back around and do 60 degrees on each. 60 degrees is about a 1/6 of a turn. If you don't have a torque wrench that reads degrees, just mark the bolt or kind of eyeball it. In the end, you don't have to be spot on. As long as you're in the ballpark of 60 degrees, it should be plenty tight. Just go around and snug all these up. All right, they're all snugged up. 15 foot-pounds is the next step. 15 foot-pounds is the next step. You want to start in the middle, the center bolts, in a cross pattern, work your way towards the outer ones. I know I didn't follow that sequence when I snugged it, but I basically just bottomed them out, so it didn't really matter. However, this time it does matter because you want to seat that oil pan gasket 100%, get it to seal up. So once again, 15 foot-pounds, start in the middle, cross pattern all the way to the outside. I'm gonna go over them twice. That way I make sure everything is good before I move on to the degree torque. I know I'm using a swivel, and swivels do alter the torque spec a little bit, but it's all I have and the only way I can reach in there. Here we go, 60 degrees. Once again, that is 1/6 of a turn if you don't have a degree reader or a digital torque wrench. Now carefully lower the engine so that we can put it back on the frame with the engine mounts. Make sure you don't pinch any lines or wires, anything else that might be in the way. All right, we got the two bottom studs in, and the top is following. That's great. All right, we're in. Perfect. Remove whatever support you used now that the engine is back on the engine mounts and on the frame. On the driver's side engine mount, let's put the three 24mm mounting nuts back on. Snug them up. .148 foot-pounds is the torque for these three mounting nuts. Okay. All right, those are tight. On the other side, put back the four 21mm mounting nuts that hold the other engine mount. Snug them up. The torque for all four of these is 85 foot-pounds. Let's reconnect these transmission lines. Give these a quick snug. There's an O-ring in there. That's what's going to seal it up nice, so you don't need to crush these down. You just need to snug them up, and that's it. Let's put this plate back on. This is the inspection cover, but also the bracket for this assembly. Stick the bolts through and try to start them on by hand. There we go. That one started. And this one. Snug them up. .26 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these bolts. Now let's bolt this back up on the bracket here. I have my bolt ready and my ratchet wrench. Push this up into position and start it in. Snug it up, and there we go. Let's tighten up the transmission mount bolts, or mounting nuts that is. 21mm socket. 85 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these. That's 1. And 2. If your truck is supposed to use this sensor, you're gonna have to unthread it with a 29mm socket, remove this plug with a 26, and then put the sensor in. For me, I know our oil pan had it, but the truck actually does not have that harness, so I'm unsure what happened there, but I can't put it on. It's not gonna do anything. So I'm gonna leave this plug in. I'm just gonna give it a quick snug with the 26mm wrench just to make sure it's sealed up properly. Make sure the oil drain plug is tightened. The torque for this is 10 foot-pounds. Since you're pretty much doing an oil change after this oil pan job, I also recommend replacing the oil filter. Now back up top, let's resecure the fan shroud onto the radiator. It had 2 10mm headed bolts, 1 on each side. Start them in and snug them up. Do the same on the other side. If you used a rag to cover the throttle body, remove it. Make sure no debris got in it. Install your adapter. Make sure it gets seated onto that throttle body and it's sealed up properly. If it isn't, you'll have some air leaks that will cause the vehicle to not run properly. And install all 4 mounting bolts, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. Start them by hand to make sure they thread in properly. Snug them up. Okay. Don't forget to plug in this line. Make sure it clicks. If you try to pull it away, it should be locked in tight. Reinstall the air intake duct on one side and on the other. Make sure the gasket here, the rubber, doesn't fold over when you slide it on. Hold it in position and tighten up the hose clamps with an 8mm socket. You don't have to go until they stop turning. If you can't move this around and the seal stays in place, that's tight enough. Do the same on this side. Snug it. This doesn't move around, so that's plenty tight. And of course, don't forget to reattach this hose. On the passenger side of the engine, you'll see the oil filler cap here. Remove it by turning it counterclockwise, and you'll see it says 5W20 on it. That's the engine oil type you need. And this engine takes 7 quarts of that. Now, if you pre-filled the filter, obviously that's part of the 7 quarts. If not, put 7 quarts in here. All right, I'm on my last quart. If you used a funnel, remove it. Reinstall the oil filler cap. Tighten it up. On the driver's side of the engine compartment, you'll see the yellow dipstick with a round ring on it at the top. This is the one for the engine oil. The one on the other side next to the oil filler is actually for the transmission. So pull the dipstick out completely. We're going to have to wipe it off because at first the reading will be inaccurate. The dipstick already has some oil on it from it being in the oil pan. Once you wipe it off, you'll see the clear markings of the low side and the high side. Between the two should be about a quart worth of oil, but if you put 7 quarts in, with the engine not started yet, it should be right above the full mark. If you have already started your engine and then shut it back off, let it sit for a few minutes, it should be right at the full mark. If you're low because you did not put 7 quarts in, well, you're going to have to add more. 7 quarts should be right about here, like I said. Now dip it back in, all the way down, and then pull it back out. At this time, we will not be wiping it off because we need to take a reading of what it says. As you can see, it's right up to the full mark, so we're good to go. Once you're done, stick it back into the dipstick tube, all the way down. And there we go. Because we had transmission lines disconnected, it is always a good idea to check the fluid level on the transmission. You'll find the dipstick for that on the passenger side right behind the battery. You're going to lift it up and off and just inspect it before the vehicle runs. And as you can see, there's still plenty of fluid in the transmission, so it is safe to run and drive. However, to check the transmission fluid properly, you want the transmission warmed up after you've gone through preferably all the gears and then parked it with the in-park engine running on a flat level surface. What you want to aim for is on one side you'll have these markings that have an H on them. That stands for hot. You want the fluid level to be right at the top of that. If you flip it over, you'll see other markings with a C. I know this is upside down, but the C stands for cold. This is if you are unable to warm up your transmission for whatever reason, if you can't drive the truck, go by this. Then after you warm it up, top it off and make sure that it's full on the hot side. We didn't lose a lot of fluid, so I would guess about a quarter to half a quart should do it if it was already full. And to fill it, you would fill it right through the dipstick tube. The transmission fluid type you want to use is Mercon LV.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.